In the grand halls of the Kremlin, where the echoes of centuries-old conspiracies still whispered through stone corridors, one of history's most shocking acts of paternal betrayal was about to unfold. The year was 1581, and Ivan IV of Russia, known to history as Ivan the Terrible, stood at the precipice of a decision that would forever stain his legacy with the blood of his own son. The relationship between Tsar Ivan and his eldest son, Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich, had deteriorated from paternal pride to murderous paranoia, culminating in an act so heinous that it would haunt the Russian royal family for generations. The story of this royal betrayal begins not with poison, but with the complex psychology of a ruler whose mind had been twisted by decades of absolute power, political intrigue, and personal trauma. Ivan the Terrible had earned his fearsome epithet through years of brutal suppression of the boyar nobility, the establishment of the oprichnika, his personal secret police, and a reign of terror that had left thousands dead in his wake. By 1581, the Tsar was a man consumed by paranoia, seeing enemies in every shadow and threats to his power in every conversation. Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich, born in 1554, had grown up in this atmosphere of fear and violence, yet had somehow managed to develop into everything his father was not: compassionate, intelligent, and genuinely concerned with the welfare of the Russian people. As he matured into adulthood, the prince began to question his father's brutal methods and increasingly tyrannical rule. This divergence in philosophy and approach to governance would prove to be the seed of the tragedy that was to come. The prince's education had been comprehensive and sophisticated, befitting the heir to one of Europe's largest empires. He spoke multiple languages, was well-versed in theology and philosophy, and had received military training that prepared him for the responsibilities of leadership. Unlike his father, who had become increasingly isolated and suspicious, Ivan Ivanovich maintained relationships with foreign diplomats, church leaders, and members of the nobility who had survived his father's purges. These connections, while politically valuable, also made him appear threatening to a Tsar who trusted no one. The first serious rift between father and son occurred in 1579, when the prince began openly criticizing the ongoing Livonian War, a costly and ultimately futile conflict that had drained Russia's treasury and cost thousands of lives. Ivan Ivanovich argued that the war was destroying the country and that resources should be redirected toward internal development and the welfare of the Russian people. His father, who saw the war as essential to his legacy and Russia's expansion, viewed these criticisms as treasonous challenges to his authority. The prince's opposition to the war was not merely philosophical. He had witnessed firsthand the suffering it had caused during his travels throughout the Russian territories. He had seen villages burned, families destroyed, and entire regions depopulated by the conflict's demands for soldiers and resources. His reports to his father about these conditions were met with increasing hostility, as Ivan the Terrible interpreted his son's compassion as weakness, and his suggestions for reform as implicit criticism of the Tsar's judgment. The situation was further complicated by the prince's marriage to Elena Sheremeteva in 1581, a union that his father had initially approved but later came to resent. Elena was from a prominent boyar family that had managed to survive Ivan the Terrible's purges, and her influence over the prince was seen by the Tsar as potentially dangerous. The young couple's happiness and their obvious affection for each other seemed to highlight the Tsar's own isolation and the loveless nature of his political marriages. As 1581 progressed, the relationship between father and son deteriorated rapidly. The prince began attending fewer court functions, spending more time with his wife and a small circle of trusted advisors who shared his vision for a more humane approach to governance. This withdrawal from court life was interpreted by Ivan the Terrible as preparation for a coup, and he began to see his son not as his heir, but as his greatest threat. The Tsar's paranoia was fed by members of his inner circle who saw an opportunity to advance their own positions by encouraging his suspicions about the prince. Chief among these was Malyuta Skuratov, the head of the Oprichnika, who had built his career on identifying and eliminating threats to Ivan's rule. Skuratov began feeding the Tsar carefully crafted reports about the prince's activities, suggesting that Ivan Ivanovich was building a network of supporters who planned to depose his father and end the war on terms favorable to Russia's enemies. The truth was far more benign than these reports suggested. The prince was indeed building relationships with various factions within the Russian nobility and clergy, but his goal was to prepare for his eventual succession and to build consensus for the reforms he believed were necessary to save the country. His meetings with foreign diplomats were aimed at exploring peaceful solutions to the Livonian conflict, not at betraying Russian interests. However, in the fevered imagination of Ivan the Terrible, these activities appeared to confirm his worst fears about his son's loyalty. The final catalyst for the tragedy that was to unfold came in November 1581, when the prince made a formal request to his father for permission to lead a military expedition to relieve the siege of Pskov, a key Russian fortress that was under attack by Polish forces. The prince argued that his presence at the front would boost morale among the troops and demonstrate the royal family's commitment to the war effort. He also privately hoped that a successful military campaign would restore his father's confidence in him and repair their damaged relationship. Ivan the Terrible's response to this request revealed the full extent of his paranoia and the depth of his suspicion toward his son. Rather than seeing the offer as an act of loyalty and duty, the Tsar interpreted it as evidence that the prince was planning to use the army to march on Moscow and seize the throne. The idea that his own son would lead Russian forces against him became an obsession that consumed the Tsar's thoughts and drove him to contemplate the unthinkable. The decision to poison his own son was not made in a moment of rage, but was the result of weeks of careful planning and psychological preparation. Ivan the Terrible had used poison before to eliminate enemies, and he understood its advantages over more direct forms of assassination. A poisoning could be made to appear as a natural illness, avoiding the political complications that would arise from the obvious murder of the heir to the throne. More importantly, it would allow the Tsar to maintain the fiction that he was a grieving father rather than a filicidal tyrant. The method chosen for the prince's murder reflected both the Tsar's cunning and his intimate knowledge of his son's habits and preferences. Ivan Ivanovich was known to enjoy wine from his father's private cellar, particularly a rare vintage from the Crimean region that was reserved for special occasions. The Tsar decided to use this wine as the vehicle for delivering the poison, knowing that his son would not suspect treachery from such a personal and seemingly affectionate gift. The poison selected for the assassination was arsenic, a substance that was readily available in the royal household and could be administered in doses that would cause a gradual decline rather than immediate death. This would allow time for the Tsar to establish his alibi and for court physicians to attribute the prince's illness to natural causes. The preparation of the poisoned wine was carried out in absolute secrecy, with only the Tsar himself and one trusted servant involved in the process. As November 1581 drew to a close, Ivan the Terrible prepared to commit the most heinous act of his bloody reign. The stage was set for a betrayal that would shock even a court accustomed to violence and treachery, and that would forever alter the course of Russian history. The prince who had represented hope for a more humane future was about to become the victim of his father's paranoid delusions, and the Rurik dynasty that had ruled Russia for centuries was about to begin its descent toward extinction. The winter of 1581 in Moscow was particularly harsh, with snow falling heavily on the Kremlin's ancient walls and ice forming thick layers on the Moscow River. Inside the palace, however, a different kind of coldness had settled over the royal household, the chill of suspicion, fear, and impending tragedy. Tsar Ivan the Terrible had made his decision, and now he began the careful orchestration of his son's murder, a crime so monstrous that even his closest advisors would later claim ignorance of the plot. The preparation for the prince's assassination required meticulous planning and absolute secrecy. Even the Terrible could not risk word of his intentions reaching his son or any of the prince's supporters, as this would not only foil the plot, but potentially trigger the very rebellion he claimed to fear. The Tsar's paranoia had reached such heights that he trusted no one completely, not even Malyuta Skuratov and the other members of his inner circle who had encouraged his suspicions about the prince. The arsenic chosen for the poisoning was obtained from the royal apothecary, ostensibly for use in treating a skin condition that had been troubling the Tsar. Arsenic was commonly used in small doses for various medical purposes during the 16th century, making its presence in the royal household unremarkable. The apothecary, a German physician named Heinrich Staden, who had served the court for several years, prepared the substance without suspecting its true intended use, believing he was simply following the Tsar's medical instructions. Ivan the Terrible's knowledge of poisons was extensive, gained through years of eliminating enemies and rivals. He understood that arsenic's effects could be controlled through careful dosing. Too much would cause immediate and obvious symptoms that would raise suspicions, while too little might not achieve the desired result. The Tsar decided on a dose that would cause the prince to fall ill gradually over several days, allowing time for the symptoms to be attributed to natural causes while ensuring that the outcome would be fatal. The selection of the wine as the delivery method was particularly cruel, as it exploited the prince's trust in his father and his appreciation for the finer things in life. Ivan Ivanovich had inherited his mother's refined tastes and had always enjoyed the rare wines that his father occasionally shared with him during their better moments. The Crimean vintage chosen for the poisoning held special significance, as it had been a gift from a Tatar Khan who had submitted to Russian authority, a symbol of the empire's expansion that the Tsar hoped would appeal to his son's sense of duty and patriotism. The actual preparation of the poisoned wine took place in the Tsar's private chambers on the evening of November 15th, 1581. Ivan the Terrible dismissed his servants and personally mixed the arsenic into the wine, using a small silver spoon that he later had melted down to destroy any evidence of its use. The process was conducted with ritualistic precision, as if the Tsar was performing some dark ceremony rather than preparing to murder his own child. Contemporary accounts suggest that he prayed throughout the process, asking God to forgive him for what he claimed was a necessary act to preserve the Russian state. The opportunity to deliver the poisoned wine came 2 days later, when the prince made one of his increasingly rare visits to his father's chambers to discuss the situation at Pskov and to renew his request to lead a relief expedition. The meeting had been arranged through intermediaries, as direct communication between father and son had become strained and formal. Ivan Ivanovich arrived at the appointed time, dressed in his finest robes and carrying gifts for his father, icons and books that he hoped would demonstrate his continued loyalty and affection. The Tsar's performance during this final meeting with his son was masterful in its deception. He greeted Ivan Ivanovich warmly, embracing him and speaking of his pride in the prince's dedication to Russia's cause. He listened attentively to his son's arguments about the military situation and even appeared to consider the request to lead the expedition to Pskov. The conversation lasted for over an hour, during which the Tsar gradually steered the discussion toward more personal topics, reminiscing about the prince's childhood and expressing regret for the distance that had grown between them. As the meeting drew to a close, Ivan the Terrible produced the bottle of Crimean wine, explaining that he had been saving it for a special occasion and that his son's visit provided the perfect opportunity to share it. The prince was visibly moved by this gesture, interpreting it as a sign that their relationship might be healing. He accepted the wine gratefully and drank deeply from the goblet his father offered, praising its quality and expressing his appreciation for his father's thoughtfulness. The poison began its work immediately, though its effects would not become apparent for several hours. Arsenic typically causes initial symptoms that can be easily mistaken for common ailments: nausea, stomach pain, and fatigue, allowing the victim to leave the scene of the poisoning without suspicion. Ivan Ivanovich finished his wine, spent another few minutes in conversation with his father, and then departed for his own chambers, feeling slightly unwell, but attributing his discomfort to the stress of their difficult relationship and the ongoing political tensions. The prince's illness began in earnest during the night of November 17th. He awoke with severe stomach cramps and nausea, symptoms that his wife Elena initially attributed to something he had eaten. The royal physicians were summoned, but their initial examination revealed nothing obviously wrong beyond what appeared to be a digestive upset. They prescribed rest and a bland diet, standard treatments for such conditions, having no reason to suspect that the heir to the throne had been deliberately poisoned. As the hours passed, however, the prince's condition worsened dramatically. The arsenic was causing systematic damage to his internal organs, particularly his digestive system and liver. He began experiencing severe vomiting and diarrhea, accompanied by intense abdominal pain that left him writhing in agony. His skin took on a grayish pallor, and his hair began to fall out in clumps. Classic symptoms of arsenic poisoning that the court physicians, lacking modern medical knowledge, failed to recognize. Ivan the Terrible's reaction to news of his son's illness was a carefully orchestrated performance of paternal concern and grief. He visited the prince's chambers multiple times each day, bringing additional physicians and expressing his anguish at his son's suffering. He ordered prayers to be said in all the churches of Moscow and even consulted with foreign doctors who happened to be in the city, desperate to find a cure for his son's mysterious ailment. To all observers, he appeared to be a devoted father, doing everything possible to save his child's life. Behind this facade, however, the Tsar was carefully monitoring the progress of the poison and ensuring that no one discovered the true cause of the prince's illness. He had positioned trusted agents among the medical staff to report on their findings and to subtly influence their diagnoses away from any suspicion of poisoning. When one physician suggested that the symptoms might indicate some form of toxic exposure, he was quietly dismissed from the case and sent away from Moscow on a diplomatic mission. The prince's suffering continued for 6 agonizing days, during which his condition steadily deteriorated despite the efforts of the medical team. Elena Sheremeteva rarely left her husband's side, holding his hand and trying to comfort him as he endured waves of pain and nausea. The prince, even in his agony, maintained his dignity and continued to express concern for the welfare of the Russian people and the outcome of the war. His final conversations with his wife and close friends revealed a man who remained noble and compassionate even as he faced death. On November 19th, as the prince's condition reached its most critical stage, he experienced a brief period of clarity that allowed him to have a final conversation with his father. Ivan the Terrible, maintaining his performance to the end, knelt beside his son's bed and spoke of his love and pride. The prince, perhaps sensing that his time was short, used this opportunity to make a final plea for his father to end the war and to rule with greater mercy and compassion. He spoke of his vision for Russia's future and his hope that his death might somehow contribute to the peace and prosperity of the realm. The Tsar's response to his son's dying words revealed the full extent of his psychological deterioration. Rather than being moved by his son's nobility and selflessness, Ivan the Terrible interpreted the prince's final plea as confirmation of his treasonous intentions. In his twisted mind, even these deathbed words were evidence of his son's disloyalty and his plans to undermine the war effort. This final delusion allowed the Tsar to maintain his conviction that the murder had been necessary and justified. Ivan Ivanovich died in the early hours of November 20th, 1581, surrounded by his grieving wife, a handful of loyal friends, and his murderous father. His death was officially attributed to a sudden illness of unknown origin, and the court physicians signed documents attesting to the natural causes of his demise. The prince's body was prepared for burial, with all the honors due to an heir to the throne, and elaborate funeral arrangements were made to demonstrate the Tsar's grief and the nation's loss. The immediate aftermath of the prince's death saw an outpouring of genuine grief from the Russian people, who had seen in Ivan Ivanovich a hope for a better future. Foreign diplomats reported that the prince's death was mourned throughout the empire, with many expressing the belief that Russia had lost its best chance for peace and reform. The Tsar's public displays of grief were so convincing that even those who had witnessed his increasingly erratic behavior had no suspicion that he had murdered his own son. However, the psychological impact of the crime on Ivan the Terrible himself was immediate and devastating. Within days of the funeral, he began showing signs of severe mental distress, experiencing nightmares, hallucinations, and periods of uncontrollable rage followed by deep depression. The guilt and horror of what he had done, combined with the realization that he had destroyed his own dynasty's future, began to consume him from within. The Tsar, who had terrorized Russia for decades, was now being terrorized by his own conscience and the ghost of his murdered son. The death of Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich sent shockwaves through the Russian court and beyond, though the full horror of what had transpired remained hidden beneath layers of official mourning and carefully constructed lies. In the weeks following the prince's funeral, Ivan the Terrible's behavior became increasingly erratic and disturbing, as the psychological weight of his crime began to manifest in ways that even his most loyal supporters could not ignore. The Tsar, who had once ruled through calculated terror, was now being consumed by an internal terror of his own making. The immediate political consequences of the prince's death were catastrophic for the Russian succession. With Ivan Ivanovich gone, the heir to the throne was now Fyodor Ivanovich, the Tsar's second son, who was widely regarded as mentally deficient and completely unsuited for rule. Fyodor was a gentle, pious man who showed more interest in religious contemplation than in the complexities of statecraft. His obvious inadequacies as a potential ruler created a succession crisis that would ultimately lead to the Time of Troubles, one of the most chaotic periods in Russian history. Ivan the Terrible's guilt manifested itself in increasingly bizarre and self-destructive behaviors. He began experiencing vivid hallucinations in which he claimed to see his dead son standing at the foot of his bed, sometimes pleading for justice and sometimes accusing his father of murder. These nocturnal visitations became so frequent and disturbing that the Tsar began refusing to sleep in his own chambers, instead wandering the palace corridors at night like a tormented ghost himself. The Tsar's physical health also began to deteriorate rapidly in the months following the murder. Court physicians noted dramatic changes in his appearance and demeanor. His hair turned completely white within weeks of his son's death. His hands developed a persistent tremor, and he lost significant weight as his appetite disappeared. More troubling still were the episodes of uncontrollable rage that would suddenly overtake him, during which he would scream accusations at invisible enemies and sometimes attack servants or courtiers who happened to be nearby. As 1582 dawned, rumors began to circulate within the court about the true circumstances of the prince's death. Several servants who had been present during the final meeting between father and son reported strange inconsistencies in the Tsar's behavior that night. A chambermaid claimed to have seen Ivan the Terrible disposing of a wine bottle in an unusual manner, while a guard reported hearing the Tsar talking to himself about necessary sacrifices and the burden of kingship. These whispers never coalesced into open accusations, but they created an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that permeated the entire palace. The most damaging evidence of the Tsar's guilt came from an unexpected source. his own confessions during periods of religious fervor. Ivan the Terrible had always been deeply religious, albeit in a twisted way that allowed him to reconcile his brutal actions with his Christian faith. After his son's death, however, his religious observances became obsessive and increasingly focused on themes of sin, guilt, and divine punishment. During private sessions with his confessor, Father Sylvester, the Tsar began making cryptic references to the greatest sin a father can commit, and speaking of his need for divine forgiveness for the murder of innocents. Father Sylvester, bound by the seal of confession, could not reveal the specific content of these sessions, but his own behavior changed dramatically after hearing the Tsar's admissions. The priest, who had served the royal family for decades, began avoiding private audiences with Ivan the Terrible and showed visible signs of distress whenever he was required to perform religious services for the court. His obvious discomfort and the Tsar's increasingly manic religious behavior led many to suspect that something terrible had been revealed in the confessional. The international implications of the prince's death became apparent as foreign diplomats and intelligence networks began to piece together the truth about what had happened in Moscow. The English ambassador, Sir Jerome Horsey, reported to London that he had grave suspicions about the circumstances of the prince's demise, and noted the dramatic change in the Tsar's behavior following his son's death. Similar reports reached other European courts, where the death of Ivan Ivanovich was increasingly viewed not as a tragic accident, but as evidence of Ivan the Terrible's complete descent into madness. The most detailed account of the murder came from Heinrich Staden, the German physician who had unknowingly provided the arsenic used to poison the prince. Staden had initially accepted the official explanation for the prince's death, but as he observed the Tsar's deteriorating mental state and reflected on the unusual circumstances surrounding his request for arsenic, he began to suspect the truth. In his private journals, which would not be discovered until centuries later, Staden recorded his growing conviction that he had been an unwitting accomplice to regicide. Staden's journals provide a chilling insight into the Tsar's state of mind in the months following the murder. The physician noted that Ivan the Terrible had become obsessed with poison, frequently asking detailed questions about various toxic substances and their effects on the human body. The Tsar also began requesting larger quantities of arsenic and other poisons, ostensibly for medical purposes, but in amounts that far exceeded any legitimate therapeutic use. Staden became so concerned about these requests that he began diluting the substances he provided, fearing that the Tsar might be planning additional murders. The truth about the prince's death began to emerge more clearly in late 1582, when Malyuta Skuratov, the head of the Oprichnika, who had encouraged the Tsar's suspicions about his son, made a deathbed confession to a trusted priest. Skuratov, dying of natural causes and apparently seeking absolution for his role in the tragedy, revealed that he had known about the Tsar's plans to poison the prince and had helped to cover up the crime afterward. His confession included details about the preparation of the poisoned wine and the Tsar's behavior during the days following the murder. The priest who heard Skuratov's confession, Father Dmitry Volkonsky, faced an agonizing moral dilemma. The information he had received was not technically protected by the seal of confession, as Skuratov had not been seeking formal absolution, but rather unburdening himself to a friend. However, revealing the truth would likely result in his own death and could potentially destabilize the entire Russian state. After weeks of prayer and contemplation, Father Dmitry decided to record Skuratov's confession in a sealed document that he hid within the walls of his monastery, hoping that future generations might someday learn the truth about the prince's murder. As 1583 progressed, Ivan the Terrible's mental and physical condition continued to deteriorate at an alarming rate. The guilt and paranoia that had driven him to murder his son were now consuming him entirely, creating a feedback loop of psychological torment that left him increasingly isolated and unstable. His remaining son, Fyodor, was kept away from court as much as possible, both to protect him from his father's unpredictable rages and to shield him from the growing rumors about the prince's death. The Tsar's final months were marked by a series of increasingly desperate attempts to find peace with his conscience and his God. He made lavish donations to monasteries and churches throughout Russia, established charitable foundations for orphans and widows, and even considered abdicating the throne to become a monk. These gestures, while genuine in their intent, could not alleviate the psychological burden of his crime or restore the son he had murdered in a moment of paranoid delusion. Ivan the Terrible died on March 28, 1584, at the age of 53, his body and mind destroyed by the weight of his crimes and the torment of his guilt. His death was officially attributed to a stroke, but those who had witnessed his final months understood that he had been killed by the psychological consequences of murdering his own son. The Tsar, who had terrorized Russia for decades, had ultimately become the victim of his own monstrous actions. The ascension of Fyodor I to the throne confirmed the worst fears about the succession crisis that Ivan Ivanovich's death had created. The new Tsar was completely unsuited for rule, and effective power quickly passed to his brother-in-law, Boris Godunov, who would eventually claim the throne himself. The Rurik dynasty, which had ruled Russia for over 7 centuries, was effectively ended by Ivan the Terrible's act of filicide, leading to the chaotic time of troubles that would plague Russia for the next 3 decades. The truth about Ivan Ivanovich's murder remained officially hidden for centuries, protected by the interests of those who had participated in or benefited from the cover-up. However, the evidence gradually accumulated through private documents, confessions, and the testimony of witnesses who had observed the Tsar's behavior during and after the crime. Modern historians, armed with this evidence and a better understanding of arsenic poisoning, have been able to reconstruct the events of November 1581 with considerable accuracy. The story of Ivan the Terrible's murder of his son serves as one of history's most shocking examples of how absolute power can corrupt absolutely, leading even a father to destroy his own child in service of his paranoid delusions. The prince, who might have saved Russia from the chaos that followed instead, became the victim of his father's madness, his death marking the beginning of the end for one of Europe's most enduring royal dynasties. The legacy of this royal betrayal extends far beyond the immediate political consequences for Russia. It stands as a timeless reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the tragic consequences that can result when fear and paranoia override the most basic human bonds. The image of Ivan the Terrible standing over his son's deathbed while maintaining the pretense of grief remains one of the most haunting scenes in the long and bloody history of royal crime. In the end, the Tsar, who had sought to preserve his power by eliminating the son he saw as a threat, succeeded only in destroying everything he had worked to build. The dynasty ended, the country fell into chaos, and the father who had committed the ultimate betrayal found himself haunted by his crime until his dying day. The prince, who had been poisoned by his own father, became in death a more powerful force for change than he had ever been in life, his murder serving as the catalyst for the transformation of Russia and the eventual end of the system that had made such a crime possible.